on today's StoryBeat.
And Bob Fosse especially was one of the most brilliant things that he did was taking dancers and making them realize that there were other parts of their performance that they needed to work on and become an actor and work on developing those kinds of feelings and emotions and things.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Gary Flannery, is a professional dancer, choreographer, and director who's toured the world as Shirley MacLaine's performance partner. He's been a principal dancer in Hollywood movies and on TV shows. He became Bob Fosse's protégé after receiving scholarships in ballet at Julliard and in George Balanchine's School of American Ballet. Gary subsequently became Fosse's lead dancer on Broadway in Pippin and Dancin and was principal dancer in Fosse's brilliant movie, All That Jazz. Bob Fosse called Gary the Bull for his nonstop dance till you drop attitude that he brought to rehearsals as well as performances. Fosse, Gwen Verdon, and even Fred Astaire all commented that Gary's work in Dancin amounted to one of the finest dance performances they had ever seen. Gary lectures and teaches master classes and seminars at universities, dance schools, and colleges around the world. He teaches every level of the Fosse repertoire, including ballet, jazz, modern, tap, hip hop, as well as dance and musical theater history. Gary also directs and choreographs, writes plays, musicals, and revues, and still performs. Among the numerous shows he's directed and choreographed are such well-known musicals as Chicago, The Music Man, West Side Story, Sweeney Todd, Fiddler on the Roof, Evita, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, and many others. Presently, Gary is hard at work finishing his multi-level project, The Great American Revue, with books, documentaries, and revivals being planned. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct honor and true privilege to welcome the extraordinary, multi-talented Gary Flannery to StoryBeat today. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's my pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is truly all mine, believe that. So let's go back in time a little bit and talk about a bit of your history. You've been a dancer and a choreographer for, quite a long time now. At what age did you first become interested in being a dancer? How old were you?
Well, I was 5. I'm Russian and Irish.
Okay.
And my Russian grandmother, if anyone was ADD, it was me as a child. And so they used to literally tie me up even like inside the house so I wouldn't destroy the place. So my grandmother decided to channel some of that energy, and she had supported ballet in Russia. And so she found me a Russian ballet teacher in the Philadelphia area, and that pretty much started it. I kind of liked it at first. He was very strict, and there were no recitals or any nonsense. It was just like class. And so I learned right from the beginning that it was kind of serious work.
And even at 5, you had an aptitude for it. You liked it.
I did, but I didn't like the constant pressure from my peers who would find out, that I was dancing.
When you say pressure, was it that, because it was girlish or something like that?
Exactly. And I'm from rural Pennsylvania, sports heaven,
Right.
I mean, they went right from my schools into Penn State, into the Pittsburgh, into the, Philadelphia Eagles or whatever. And
right.
So I played some sports. I loved baseball, especially, and played Little League baseball. And again, I would sort of come in and out of dance class, but then my teacher would call my mom and was like, "Where is he? Get him in here."
Well, so your teacher, even at that age, probably
Yes.
recognized you had something going on.
Well, I was one of the few guys around, right? So I think that helped a little.
I see.
He took a real wonderful interest in me and making me realize what I was doing.
Right.
Was
Well,
not only going to help me physically, because I was a skinny little runt, and but that this might even be something that I could do.
so did you think of it as you were growing up? Did it become a calling for you? It was something that
About 10. Yeah, about 10 years old, I was, not only going to him, I think I already had changed and started going to another teacher in the area, which was like the boys' club. I mean, she turned out these guys one after another, and they went to Hollywood, and they got scholarships to schools and Julliard and whatever. And so I went and studied with her, Jean Williams, wonderful lady and teacher. And that's when I pretty much decided that this was something I really loved, and I was going to do the rest of my life. And
so when you found this out at 10, did you feel
Yeah.
at that moment that you were actually good enough at it that you could pursue it?
I still don't feel like I'm good enough, but I'm still learning. So,
I think that's important, Gary, because
Well, it is.
you never stop learning. And if you do stop learning, basically you're finished at that point.
Right. Well, and that's the lecture that I give my students pretty much all the time.
Mhm.
And so my parents used to threaten me and punish me by trying to keep me from going to dance class.
Oh,
And then I'd climb out my upstairs window, over the roof and hitchhike, to go at 10, 11 years old. And I'm taking buses and trains and everything in and out of Center City, Philadelphia myself at 10, 11 years old. I'm going to class now almost daily.
wow.
Yeah, and a full day Saturday of classes. And so I was getting pretty serious. I stopped all the sports and other things I was doing. And
Do you think of dance as an athletic thing?
oh, absolutely. My whole life, I thought of it as that, and again, definitely realized that it was helping me physically
Mhm.
in my body, but that not to the point that I was going to try to become, a professional athlete necessarily, although there was this track thing that happened, and that was pretty interesting. But
What track thing? What happened?
well, I was in New York City. I was being tutored and going to a school in New York City, through most of my high school. And then New York City schools went on strike. So I was like, "Blah." and then my school in Pennsylvania said I had to come home, for that last part of my senior year, or they weren't going to graduate me. And so I went back to school. I didn't find anywhere to dance right offhand. And so track coach was my civics teacher and decided, he had heard and seen me. I used to do humanities programs all the time for the schools. And so he said, "You're going to run track for me." I was like, "Hey, we're in track. The heck we're on track for?" So he's like, "You're going to run track or you're going to flunk." So,
Wow.
well, I mean, he was an Olympian. He was a really nice guy, but he semi-threatened me, and so he took me out in the back of the school on this little 220 track around the blacktop, and we decided I would probably run long distance since I was used to dancing 12 hours a day, and so at that time there was the 2-mile run. And so I started running with the long distance guys of the track team. And he saw that I wasn't even like trying and breathing hard. And so he said, go ahead, go ahead. So I just started kind of sprinting. And
So you had amazing lung power at that moment.
absolutely insane, and I practiced that as well, with Tai Chi and various breathing exercises.
And you clearly must have had very strong legs as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so I broke the school record in the 2-mile run by 1.5 minutes.
Wow.
First time I ever ran in my life. And the other guys on the track team just walked off the track and just stood there just freaking out. And so eventually I was ranked second in the East Coast, pretty much second in the country in the 1 and 2-mile run in high school. Got offered track scholarships to Villanova, to San Jose State, and all over the country. I took a second place in the East Coast Championships in the 2-mile run.
But you had no interest in it. Is that what happened?
None.
Wow.
But I did want to show up, the football players and everybody that used to laugh at me, and so in that sense, it was an accomplishment. Now, there wasn't professional track back then. And nowadays, these guys make $100,000 a race.
Sure.
And I could have easily been up there, in a world class.
You could have at least supported yourself with track while you worked on dance.
Well, I did a 4:09 mile.
Wow, that's really excellent.
Oh, ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. So at what point then? This is still high school, right?
Yeah. So I already had a full scholarship to Julliard then.
I see. You already had the scholarship in your back pocket.
And so I'm telling these track coaches I'm going to Julliard. They're like, what the hell is that?
Well, right. I think you clearly did the right thing. It's what you wanted to do.
I think so too. Absolutely.
All right. So let's talk about, you're in Julliard, and I'm going to guess that they're pushing you toward working on various dance recitals as well as musicals. Yes, at Julliard?
No, I had a ballet scholarship, a full ballet scholarship. And so I was there strictly for ballet, but I mean, I had Anthony Tudor, who was, the director of Julliard as well as American Ballet Theater for 40 years.
Right.
And I had already done 2 different professional companies and done musicals in Canada and stuff before I even went to Julliard again and came back to school.
I see.
And so I already had all of this experience and performing experience. And so while I was at Julliard, all of my teachers, including Anthony Tudor, Martha Graham, personally asked me to join the Graham Company because I used to sneak over to her place on some nights that I wasn't supposed to be doing. And Jose Limon, my other modern teacher, asked me to join his company. Now I'm a freshman, but yet I'm pretty much the most advanced dancer in the school, already. And all of my teachers are trying to get me to leave. So I finally told my dad, I was like, Dad, Anne of Green Gables called up again and we're going on a world tour. And they're offering me, almost $2,000 a week in 1969.
Oh, that's a lot of money.
Oh my goodness, and half of that, 1,000 a week, was going to be per diem, just, in your pocket. So, and they were paying all expenses anyway. And so I was like, Dad, I'm leaving school. This is ridiculous. And so I did. And I only lasted a year at Julliard. But I went up and told Martha Hill, the directress, and she's like, well, you're probably doing the right thing. And I said, well, according to Jerome Robbins, I am, who I used to talk with a lot while I was a juror.
Right.
And
so Jerome Robbins himself was telling you need to move on and go pro.
Yeah. He was there in the same building at Lincoln Center, houses not only Julliard and the whole Julliard school,
right,
but the dance floor, walks into the New York City Ballet, into, their rehearsal studios and everything else. And so Jerome was there working on Dances at a Gathering, and he used to be in the lunchroom all the time, the little cafeteria inside, and I'd go in and chat with him, and say, well, this is really stupid, and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing,
Well,
And
if Jerome Robbins is going to tell you should turn pro, I would say that's a good clue.
That's exactly what I did. I said, this man is probably the most knowledgeable person I'm talking to. And so, I'm going to take his suggestion and move on.
Probably among the top 3 to 5, best choreographers.
And
ever.
he was such a delight. I mean, he had all kinds, as Fosse had all kinds of negative remarks about him and his work and how mean he was and blah, blah, blah. And he was just a delight, to me especially, and just offered me all kinds of encouragement and success. And
wow, that's amazing, because I mean, he's a legend along Fosse's. You work with legends.
And for me, I sought out people like that, though, Steve. It wasn't there's not, as an artist growing up like that, there's not a whole lot of people you can talk to. And then sometimes even your dance teachers and coaches and things, they don't really know the business and what's going on, and certainly not your parents. And so I would seek out people that I knew what was going on in the world.
Well, that was very smart of you.
Well, I knew that I needed to do research. And so every minute I wasn't in the dance studio, I was in Lincoln Center Library looking up, books and watching videos and stuff of great dancers in all genre, from musicals through concert dance. And so I took it upon myself. Nobody ever told me to do those kinds of things.
You were what all successful people, I think, are. You were focused on what it is your goal was.
Yes. And again, it's something that I tell my students, you have to stay focused. You have to talk to people that really know what they're talking about. Just disregard the other people and move on and just keep working.
All right. So at some point you go off and you do, what was it, Anne of Green Gables? Is that what it was? All right. And you clearly, over a long period of time, you have specialized in all different disciplines in musicals, directing, choreography. You've been a dancer in musicals. What is it about musicals that attracts you? What is it you like about musicals?
Well, it's kind of the combination of the 3 arts together. You have the visual, then you have music, and then you have dance, certainly. And so it allows you as a performer to use maybe more of the gifts that you have and have worked on.
Are you a singer as well?
Oh yeah,
you had to develop that as well. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, I spent a lot of money on private coaching and classes in New York City whenever I was in and out.
Mm-hmm.
I was taking voice classes all the time, and occasional acting classes as well. But the voice classes especially, my teacher was wonderful in making tapes for me to take and practice, which I practiced religiously. And so yeah, if you're going to be a singer, you're not going to compete against these people that are singing 8 and 10 hours a day, just by humming a tune in your shower, So
did you ever sing any leads in any shows?
Sure, Anne of Green Gables, I had to lead.
I see. Okay, well, so you had to be a good singer then. It wasn't like you couldn't just blend into the background.
I played a 15-year-old boy, so I wasn't, a operatic star or anything. But over the time, I then managed to, like with Fosse, the first time I auditioned for Bob, I sang pretty well at the audition and got the job.
All right. So I'm just curious, you've been in enough musicals and you've worked on enough where you know what the routine is to do 8 shows a week.
Yes.
What's the most challenging thing about doing 8 shows a week as a performer?
I think it's the not allowing yourself to just sort of settle in and be happy that you're in a Broadway show and making these weekly paychecks. For me, it was always finding something fresh and new and just exploding, out on that stage every performance. I always had people telling me that when they started seeing me on stage, they couldn't watch anyone else. I mean, I just drew all the attention, and I had dance captains, people that were like watching the show would come up to me and say, "Oh, and this person did this once to me while I was doing Fosse's dancing show, and I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing out there. And Bob Fosse told me to go out there and give it hell every night." And sure enough, that's what I was doing. So this person comes into my dressing room after the show one night and says, "You got to pull your whole show down. You're too big out there. You're doing too much, and your kicks are too high, and your jumps are too high, and everything's blah, blah, blah." It's like, how dare you? How dare you come into my dressing room and tell me something like that? I said, if these idiots behind me can't get it up, to go out there and do this show every night, then it's your friggin' job to see that they bring their show up or find somebody else that can do the show the way it's supposed to be done. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing out there. I'm not going beyond on anything, that I was not told to do in rehearsal. And so, as a matter of fact, this is the last time you are ever speaking to me. Okay, because I am not taking any more notes. Do not even look in my direction ever. And that was the last time I saw him.
And clearly you weren't let go, so that you must have done something right.
Well, Bob Fosse, I mean, it was his show.
That's a pretty good backer to have.
Well, exactly. He'd come in and put his arm around me and says, "Thank God you're here," and even in rehearsal the one time, I wasn't in the original Dancin', although I was out on tour with Shirley MacLaine, and Bob had constantly been calling after I did Pippin with him, and then ended up leaving Pippin on Broadway with Shirley MacLaine, which was supposed to be a 3-month tour and turned into almost 3 years.
Wow.
And Bob wanted me to do Chicago, the musical. He wanted me to do this Liza with a Z show. He wanted me to do this Dancin' musical that he had put together. And he was calling me, first. Of course, I never even got any of those messages because with Shirley's manager and agent, would just say, "No, he's not going anywhere."
Because Shirley clearly liked you.
Yeah. Well, and there were only 2 guys in our show, and we did everything, and we had no understudies and standbys, and I mean, we were the show, and so.
Did you enjoy life on the road? Was that fun?
Well, to a point. I mean, it gets tedious again after so long a time.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I kept things fresh. I was always out and about and seeing the sights and taking dance ballet classes everywhere I could in the world. And so I made good use of it. I so enjoyed performing in all the various cultures and theaters that we performed in, everything from the Sydney Opera House to the London Palladium. That was just an amazing place. It's like a very, small, seemingly small theater, because the seats, the balconies just go straight up,
wow,
over top of you. And so the whole place is just like over top of you and stuff. And when they start roaring and screaming in there, it's unbelievable. And
well, Shirley MacLaine's not exactly a slouch either.
No. Our show, again, I call it the Dream Tour. There's never been anything like it in the history of performance. We broke 38 box office records around the world just in the 2.5 years that I was with her. It was the biggest show in the history of the world ever. I mean, Fred Ebb and Cy Coleman built our show, so you couldn't get any better than that, putting the show together. We had a 30-piece orchestra that we would have on stage with us. Usually they carried 6 or 10 pieces, guys around the world with us that would make up the centerpiece, and then they would bring in, a symphony orchestra from that city, and
Wow.
and it was unbelievable how brilliant and incredible the show was.
Who directed it?
Again, there were 2 different people primarily involved. Tony Sharmley originally, who was a wonderful age-old theater and director,
Sure.
and television and stuff, and he was pretty much set up most of the show originally, and he directed the Gypsy My Soul TV special that we did with Shirley, which became a lot of the basis of the live show. And then another guy, Alan Johnson, came in and took over. And so they were director, choreographers, stagers. They pretty much, set the show in that sense. And Shirley was just, every night we started the show with My Friends Could See Me Now. And she would go out and there'd be these big cheers and everything. And then she'd say, if my friends, the first 2, and we're walking on, the 2 guys standing beside her, if they could see me now, that little, and man, you may as well just plug your hand in the socket, because it was electric. And there's no one, and I worked on Broadway with Ben Vereen and Pippin, and he was pretty amazing and electric there too.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing like Shirley MacLaine. I mean, she just was incredible.
Yeah, I believe it. She is a remarkable performer. There's no question. All right, let's talk about process in dancing and choreography a little bit. As you prepare to approach a dance, do you approach each dance differently, or is your approach to dance in general the same, and then each choreography is different in some way? In other words, is your attitude toward dance the same in every number?
I would say yes. I again have the background that has completely given me a vocabulary that's almost endless, and so for me, in whether it's directing a musical production, choreographing, or staging a dance number, I will certainly study the music, even the history of the musician and the composer. Try to understand what that music is saying itself, first of all.
In terms of emotion and what you're feeling.
Yeah, and maybe again what the composer was trying to say in what he had put together. So I would take all of that into consideration, and then just pretty much work on the music scientifically, just putting things together. Again, I had endless vocabulary from every.
When you, as a dancer, did you think of yourself as being in a character, a part of some kind, or
Yes,
did you just
always.
think of yourself as a piece of a whole chorus?
No, and I always thought of myself as an acting performer.
You did.
Yes. And Bob Fosse especially was one of the most brilliant things that he did was taking dancers and making them realize that there were other parts of their performance that they needed to work on and become an actor and work on developing those kinds of of feelings and emotions and things in
So
your
that
work.
so that it had not just someone mechanically doing dance, they were actually performing a character part.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
yet that character part is a piece of a whole thing with other people involved.
Well, sure. And so, I mean, you can look at it in a sports sense with the greatest football, the baseball teams, basketball teams. You might have a tremendous leader like a Michael Jordan out there or something, but yet it's the team chemistry that really makes the difference in being a champion.
Right. Well, that's true. And so, okay, so that's a great question, which is, you've done enough different shows to know when the chemistry isn't quite working right.
Mhm.
What do you do as a performer to try to help it become a whole piece rather than a bunch of disparate people?
Leave.
Leave. That's the solution, is not that you can't work it out.
I've rarely run across it because I've always been so careful in the work that I've done or accepted. And there was a list of people, even choreographers and directors, that I wouldn't work with under any circumstance.
Because you knew you wouldn't get along with them, or philosophically they were different than yours.
Yep.
That sort of thing. So you were very selective in who you would work with.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And luckily it ended up being that I wasn't out of work that often that I had to worry about it.
Well, I was going to say, you were fortunate.
Bob Fosse and Shirley MacLaine are like fighting over me.
Well, yeah, if you've got something, right. If you're able to keep working despite turning work down, that's a pretty healthy position to be in.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So what for you?
Mention one name especially, Michael Bennett. Of course, everybody is like, well, what were you in chorus line and stuff? I was like, I never did chorus line. Okay. Why didn't you do chorus line? It's like, well, for number one, I hated Michael Bennett. Okay.
Okay.
Who I knew personally, from various friends that I had in New York City at the time and over a period of time. And he just, so I just didn't like him, as a person.
You two didn't get along. You weren't on the same page.
No, we weren't on the same page at all. And he, as far as I was concerned, used people. Like even chorus line itself. Chorus line was developed and put together in a group of meetings that two of my friends organized. And then after the second meeting or so, Michael Bennett walks in and takes over.
Huh.
Oh, yeah.
You were happy to work where you were working. You didn't need to beg for work there.
No, but it was funny because I ended up being in town when Michael actually auditioned for a chorus line. Now, the first things that they did were put together downtown with all the original people doing their own parts and things.
Right.
And yet one of the guys, the guy who, I don't remember his name, but he's kind of a football looking guy, and he sings for the wife. And so he broke his leg downtown. So now they're going into the Schubert Theater on Broadway. They're going to open on Broadway with the original Broadway company, and they're auditioning for one male to take on this part.
Right.
2,000 guys audition, 2,000 equity professional guys audition for this one role. And I was in town, so I went to it just for the heck of it. And it was crazy. It was just absolutely nuts. And yet my competitive juices were flowing, so I was just going berserk through the whole thing. And it went on for 6 hours this first day. And then after about the fourth or fifth hour, the second day, we were down to 10 guys. And I'm one of the 10. And everybody's standing on this line in the front on the stage. And they're like, oh God, I hope I get it. I hope I get it. And I'm standing there with my arms crossed, looking up to the ceiling like, I'm going to kill him. If this goes on another 10 minutes, I'm going to just strangle him. And this is the picture that ends up on the front page of the New York Times. It's perfect. I still got to find that freaking picture. It's so perfect. And so anyway, it gets down to two of us. And Michael comes up to me and he dismisses all the other 8 guys. So he chooses the two of us and he comes over to me first and he says, listen, you're not quite right for this part. And he's kind of a football, player guy. And he said, but I want you to stay and swing the show for me. And then I'll put you in as we go along. I said, that's great, Michael. I said, but I'm working with Shirley MacLaine right now. She's paying me $5,000 a week. Is that what you're going to pay me? He's like, get out of here. I was like,
well,
first he had told me that I was the most brilliant dancer he'd ever seen.
Yes, but he wasn't going. No matter how brilliant you were, he clearly was not going to pay you your rate.
Oh no, it would be ridiculous, And it was so weird because, like I said, I knew him from years before that, and knew him and socially and whatever, and yet he didn't remember who I was.
So that was not a good sign.
Well, no, but that was him. So,
or maybe you could, or maybe as you did, you can take it as a good sign and say, I'm not. This is not for me.
Well, exactly. And then I met him a couple of years later as a girlfriend that I was dating at the time was helping him choreograph and stage another show. And he was just abusing her totally. And I would come in with her and stuff. And he'd look at me like, do I know you? No, Michael, you don't know me. You don't know me at all.
All right, so let's talk about choreography because I'm
Right.
very interested in how you do these things.
Mhm.
What for you makes a good piece of choreography good? How do you define that?
Staging. Okay, so steps are easy to come by and put together somewhat, but it has to have the staging of whatever it is that you're trying to put together to make it make sense and make it interesting. And so, and that's not always easy. And
No, it's why I'm asking, because I think it's one of the more challenging things to do is to choreograph a number in a show and have it be interesting enough to hold the audience's attention.
Mhm.
And so can you give me an example of an existing dance in a show that you think is as good as it gets?
Any Bob Fosse original number from any of his shows. It's one of the more brilliant numbers, especially that he put together, was Rich Man's Frug in Sweet Charity.
Right.
The sort of 3 parts. And it wasn't enough that, you just had the one number, the one part. He separated it into 3 parts just so he could have the same number, but in 3 different sort of genres again.
Three styles.
3 different styles that were absolutely amazing and different in each of their scope. And that's why Fosse was such a genius. I mean, he was the absolute genius of doing that. And for me, that's what I look back on to try to help me envision, now, what would Bob have done?
Do you actually choreograph that way sometimes? What would Bob have done?
Yep, absolutely.
And you probably know pretty much all of his stylistic ticks and tricks. And
I do. As I've said, I wasn't in the original company of Dancin, but he threw me on Broadway, and he didn't even rehearse me in that because he was still busy doing all that jazz. And so I was put into the show, and then he would come by and take me out of the show and take me in rehearsal and say, no, this is not right. Like with Recollections of an Old Dancer, this Mr. Bojangles piece. He's like, I don't like the way, this was done. So I know you can do it right and what I want, and we're going to work on this until, and then he would send me out of the room crying like 3 times and break me in half physically, mentally. And then finally it's like, okay, I got to get back to filming. So I'd be like, and he would just leave. And be like, all right, so that's it. I'm supposed to do this in the show that night.
And so as he would break you down like that, you still felt like he was the person you most wanted to work for.
Unbelievable. I mean,
even as he was breaking you down.
If he had stepped and jumped on my head, I still would have said, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He was the man.
He was God. I mean, I still look on Bob as being a gift that I was given and the world was given in theater and theater dance. He just and there's some problems that have arisen, like some of the Fosse people today are trying to make Gwen Verdon seem like she was his inspiration and actually helped choreograph much of his work. It's like, no, not that I ever saw. And what happened was, the shows that she was in, and she was in several of his shows, he would allow her to choreograph her own style and work. Right. And then he'd come in and adjust some things here and there. And so in that sense, she did. She helped choreograph and do some things, in her parts. But she never came in to rehearsal with the general company and told him what to do.
Sure. Certainly one can imagine that just as a married couple, there was influence there, but you're saying she never came in and actually took the stage.
Well, and they were married for a while anyway.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
She never, but they're, they're trying to adjust that today. Well, and lessen Bob's genius, which to me is
I think it's pretty hard to adjust his genius. He's pretty well baked in as one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah.
I think that cake is pretty well
I hope it continues because it's the truth. And
so let's talk about another genius. You've been working for a number of years on something called the Great American Revue. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that. What is the Great American Revue about, and who, and what is going on for you with that project?
Well, I came across this name of this showman, George White. Mm-hmm. He was a hoofer. Okay, so he started as a hoofer dancing for pennies in the streets of the Bowery in 1900, and gradually went through vaudeville and went into Broadway, legit shows even. Actually was in Ziegfeld, 2 of Ziegfeld Follies shows, but he told Ziegfeld off. And Ziegfeld fired him, so he decided to do his own show, which is called George White Scandals. So the Scandal started in 1919. Okay. And he developed then a pattern going into the 20s, the Roaring 20s.
So let's be clear about the history here. This is after World War I, right, before the Great Depression.
Right.
This was before the 30s, because this was going into the Roaring 20s, and relevant to today, it was right after the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Right.
All of that. And so this guy had iron running through his veins, for one thing. And so he had no fears of anyone or anything. And so he just kept plowing on. And what he wanted to see an American show. He and all kinds of other people thought that the Ziegfeld Follies were just this old-fashioned European sort of parade out of the old English music halls. Right. And that's what it was. And so he wanted to do a fast-paced, very bold and metallic and energized kind of a show using American themes and American music. And so he hires George Gershwin to write the music, which was absolutely incredible. And this is before Gershwin was known. This is way before Gershwin is known. And Gershwin actually, in the first 2 years, in 1920 and 21, because he didn't write music in 1919. It was written by this guy, Arthur Jackson. It was really awful. And so he realized, George White, that he had to do something, especially with the music. But then he hires Airte to design the sets, costumes, and draperies, starting in 1920.
Just Airte.
Just Airte, yeah. Who created the entire Art Deco period in the Scandals.
He is the Art Deco period.
He is it. I mean, he's the father. I mean, most of it got created in the Scandals. People see all these sketches of his and his work, and they think, oh, that's pretty. What a pretty design. That was on stage in the 1922
amazing.
Scandals. I mean, Ed Sullivan, when he saw the 1926 set Scandals, said, especially this Birth of the Blues number, which was this huge thing with these angels coming down these stairways and stuff, and said people were gasping in their seats. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And that perhaps Mr. Ziegfeld should wander on by the Scandals one night so he could see what real entertainment was supposed to look like. So George White was hated by all of the aristocracy and the big, theater producers of the day, and yet he continued on, and he took $100 million out of their pockets, and yet he because of mainly two things then happening into the 40s, was the World War II, and then also the end of the review period where they started doing book musicals. And so he got cut out in those two parts of what was changing in America. But then also he never married, and no estate, no kids, no one to write about him or to speak up on his behalf. And
so you're actually you're developing material that is about George White, not necessarily about the Scandals. It's about him.
It's about him and his, the Scandals, which was his life. I mean, he did a lot of other shows. Interesting, in 1922, after the success of the Scandals, was pretty much assured, he decided that he had always been up in Harlem dancing with the Black Hoofers up in Harlem, and that's how he learned to tap dance. And so he knew up in Harlem that they were developing this dance that was going to shock the world. And so in 1922, he produces and puts together only the second Black musical on Broadway. The first one was called Shuffle Along. The second one was called Runnin' Wild. And in Runnin' Wild, George White introduces the Charleston to the world.
Oh, wow. That's big.
You would think,
I mean, that was a big, really influential dance.
Unbelievable. And George White, to his dying breath, says that he introduced this dance to the world, which is no one knows who created it necessarily. It just got sort of put together from, various peoples, but
you're saying over time George White has been pushed to the background of history, and people don't really know who he is or have any clue.
38 books and counting on Ziegfeld. No books, no movies, no documentaries, nothing on George White. And George White discovered everyone from Ray Bolger to Ann Miller, Ethel Merman, Bilbo Jangles Robinson, George Gershwin, Jimmy Durante, Bert Lahr. The list just goes on and on and on.
And Airte.
And Ethel Merman. I mean, these stories about him with Ethel Merman are just crazy.
Like what with him and Ethel
31, Merman? He's developing his show for 31, and he knows it's going to be a big success. And even after the Depression and everything, he never had money in banks or stocks or anything, so he's rolling in money in 31. He brings a girl over from Europe. She was supposed to be the big musical star of the show,
right?
And she starts pulling the star routine on George White during rehearsals, so he throws her out. They're rehearsing down in Atlantic City. So he gets in a limo, goes to New York, and has known that there was this girl who's working in an office that has this insane voice. And so he pulls her out of her office into the hallway and says, "Hit it." And she just, sings, and he's
so that she could be heard in New Jersey.
In New Jersey. So he says, "That's it. Tell your boss goodbye. You're coming with me." So he throws her in the car and takes her to Atlantic City. And Ethel Merman sings "Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries"
as loudly as anyone has ever sung it.
As anyone has ever sung. And so he nurtured and developed, so much of this talent. Eleanor Powell, the same. She was a sort of a show dancer that came out of Radio City Music Hall. And
well, why do you think it is that the various famous people that he helped to discover, why do you think that we don't hear in the histories of them talking about him?
Well, it's complicated somewhat. I think they were a little embarrassed because he was so sort of removed from the professional glory of whatever was going on. And now I interviewed several of them. I interviewed Alice Faye. I interviewed Ann Miller, and they just had these glowing, wonderful, talks about him and how nice he was. And Bert Lahr writes there's a whole chapter about him in his book, Notes on a Cowardly Lion, that John Lahr, the son, wrote, but it was Bert's pretty much words.
Right.
And he loved George White. He worked for Ziegfeld, and he said he used to have to call him Mr. Ziegfeld all the time. And yet when he worked with White, he called him Georgie. And they would sit around, after the show and smoke cigars and drink and tell jokes all night. He was just a real kind of fun, down to earth guy, and never assumed that royal position that most were climbing for. He loved the work. He loved the work. And in a similar fashion to Bob Fosse, Fosse enjoyed the accolades, and George White did too, but that wasn't their primary reason for doing what they did. And so people forgot that, and they forget that these people have gotten to their special place in history and in the history of entertainment because of their rich talent, and not because they were the life of the party.
Well, the curious thing is how the world has moved along, and George White has gotten left in the wash, and so that's what your whole point of doing your the Great American Revue is, to bring George White back up from the fog of history where he's gone.
Well, it is, and he deserves it. I mean, this man produced 88 plays and musicals on Broadway, and far and away beyond anything anyone has ever accomplished in that sense. And he did so many incredible things in film, and even in 1926. Again, I have this incredible picture of he with Irving Berlin in Joseph Schenk's office, who was the creator not only of United, Artists early on, but then created MGM, and then created 20th Century Fox.
Right.
Okay, so this is Joseph Schenck. In 1926, he has George White and Irving Berlin in his office. Okay, and I have the picture. It's unbelievable. I think it's probably the only known copy of this picture. And he is inviting these guys to put together the world's first all talking, all singing sound musical.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. But George White turns him down.
Why did he turn him down?
Because he was too busy on Broadway.
So and of course, in those days, back then, movies were a piffle compared to being on Broadway.
he underestimated
The theater
totally.
was much bigger. It was much more important than movies at that
And it
time.
was. And eventually he gave in, and Schenck himself, hired him into 20th Century Fox in 34 and 35. He made these two mega scandals movies for 20th Century Fox, starring Alice Faye, Rudy Valley, and Eleanor Powell's screen debut in the 35 movie. So eventually he came to Hollywood, but then he was out of his element and stuff there too. So he kind of left that and
that was a very dicey period for a lot of people that were in the theater. Some of them made good in Hollywood, and many of them did not.
Right.
That transition was not easy for many of them.
Well, and for him as well, and yet he still did a couple of nice projects with the 34 and 35 scandals, and it's not Busby Berkeley or anything, but there's some pretty interesting stuff, and he's in the movies themselves. So that was one of the things that he separated himself from all the other directors and choreographers and impresarios, in that he performed. He wrote the shows, he performed in them, he directed them, he choreographed them, he sold tickets. There were always these incredible stories of him out in the box office selling tickets to people.
That's amazing. Well, this is a very interesting story, and I hope you're able to bring it to light one of these days as you go down this road with your continuing research and trying to get it into some form and shape that gets produced.
Yeah.
So
it's frustrating, but yet 35 years I've been working on it. So
wow, just 35 years you've been working on it?
Yeah, half my life. So
holy moly.
I guess I can still try and plow on another couple. So
well, I truly wish you a lot of luck with it, because it sounds like it's a very interesting and worthy project. So I've been talking to Gary Flannery for almost an hour at this moment, and we're going to sort of wind this thing down a little. I'm just wondering, in all of your many experiences, and I'm sure that you've had many, can you share with us a story that is either weird, strange, quirky, offbeat, oddball, or maybe just plain funny?
Yeah, well, it was my audition for Bob Fosse, the first time I ever auditioned for him. I had come back into New York, and Pippin was on Broadway, and hadn't seen the show, had no idea what it was about or anything, but he was auditioning on Broadway for one male replacement for the show. And so I went to the audition, and we're going through all the dance routines and everything. And so I'm just destroying, all these guys on stage. And so now we get to sing, and I'm singing Promises, Promises. So now we're down to about 20 guys or so. I'm singing Promises, Promises. Bob's in the audience watching. So I start Promises, Promises. This is where those, and he says, stop. Okay, listen, I want you to start that song again. Only this time I want you to grab your crotch and start playing with yourself while you're singing.
Holy moly.
And I just came out of this kids show, Anne of Green Gables. No idea what this Pippin show is about anyway. So I'm literally standing there going like, I beg your pardon? And he stood up and got mad, and he's like, did you not hear me? I said, grab your crotch, start playing with yourself. Here we go, 1, 2, 3. And so the music's down. There's one of those promises. And I'm playing and rolling around on the floor pretty much even, and just going at it. So he's laughing and rolling around in the aisle out in the theater. And I was like, oh God, okay. Whatever. This is the great Bob Fosse, huh? Okay. So he came up, and after we had pretty much finished the audition again, it got down to like 2 of us. And so he comes up and he says, listen, this audition is for a swing for the Broadway show. It's not, a part necessarily, but I'm putting the first touring company together, and I want you to do this part in the show. And I was like, that's great. be delighted. And he said, I want you to come with me to see the show tonight, and I'll show you, what this noble part is. And so I do, and we're standing in this standing room only and chatting, and he's like, well, see the guy in the cape and the hat and stuff that's like playing with himself? I said, yes, sir. It's like, well, that's your part.
That's the role. So you auditioned for it.
I did, and I guess I did good. So it was quite funny. I mean, that was my audition for Bob Fosse.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And of course you went into it not knowing that was what you didn't know you were auditioning for a guy on stage doing that.
I beg your pardon. Really? And this is before funny. Michael Jackson, and all the grab your crotch kind of thing.
Indeed. So, all right, last question for today, Gary. Are you able to lend to those who are maybe just starting out or are in the business a little bit and trying to get to the next level, a solid piece of advice or a tip?
Practice. Practice. Prepare. Okay. I was a Cub Scout, Boy Scout for a little while, and of course their motto is what? Be prepared. And so in today's musical theater, especially, and even the dance world, you have to have a variety of tools at your disposal. And so when you go to an audition, you have to have, ballet slippers, point shoes, tap shoes, jazz shoes, modern slippers. You have to have an up-tempo, a ballad. You have to have Shakespeare monologues prepared. You got it all in your bag, man. So when you go to that audition, you can't afford to not get this job because you weren't prepared. So yes, you have to study and make sure that you have all the right tools that you've been gathering together over the years to make sure that that you get the job. Because what happens so many times is you may audition for a show or a musical or something, and they have casting directors that are there. So it's not just the producer or director or choreographer that is watching the audition, it's the casting directors that are literally, doing the audition. And so they may have you right away in mind on it for another show, even Shakespeare.
So what you're saying is extremely valuable advice. When you go in for an audition, you're not just auditioning for that show, though you are, but you're also putting yourself out as a viable player in who knows what else. And so every audition has value to potentially other shows.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. And for me, that has always worked. I go into an audition totally prepared, knowing that there's not a single thing that they can throw at me that I can't do, be it dancing, singing, acting, what have you. And I get the job. Besides the fact that I'm dressed in a red unitard with matching red, jazz shoes on and stuff, and everybody else, all the other guys are there in black and white.
So you're already standing out.
They may as well get their bag and go home, right?
Well, Gary Flannery, this has been an absolutely spectacular hour on StoryBeat. So many great stories, and
so much.
And I can't thank you enough for spending a little time with me today. And, I wish you well with all your projects.
Well, it's great. I enjoyed teaching, and over the years in the universities, especially, I taught theater and dance history. And so for me, it's so important to have young people, involved in theater and dance, but also to know what it's all about. I mean, it's not just a party, man.
It's not just a party. It's actually something important in many people's lives, and it's also work and it's sustenance.
Yes. Yeah.
So
and for me, it will be for the next 20 or 30 years.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears. So
exactly.
Gary, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Steve. I enjoy your show, and I wish you all the best success yourself.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.